Hey, good morning, agents. This is Captain Herzon on the Wooten Forensic Science YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be talking about relative to Chapter 1 in Criminalistics by Richard Safferstein. Uh, that covers more about some disciplines associated with forensic science, as well as some of the historical perspectives in terms of the main contributors in forensic science. So, starting off right with the term forensic science. What's the background information uh, about this term, and how does it apply to actually crime scene investigations? Okay, well, we first have to look at each word. Forensic is derived from the Latin word forensis, meaning a debate or an argument or a public discussion. And um, when we're talking about crime scene investigations, everything that has been learned um, actually gets discussed, debated, argued um, in a legal setting like a courtroom, or it could also um, um, be conducted as a hearing that is outside of the courtroom. Science refers to any science used or discussed in a court of law, and it pertains the use of scientific principles to determine cases of legal importance. Now, cases of legal importance can refer to a multitude of situations. For example, um, a crime scene that has um, the remains of a human person, and they're trying to find out what did this person die of, and uh, um, uh, more notably, what was the cause of death? Okay, and then we have to think about responsibility. Who is responsible for this person's death? And that's called um, the manner of death. Okay, uh, and this also can lead to involve things like loss of property as well. Um, okay, sorry, I got tongue tied there. So, scientific principles that are mentioned, what these pertain to is the scientific method, and their techniques in acquiring new knowledge or correcting and integrating previous knowledge. The, to be termed scientific, a method of inquiry must be based on gathering empirical and measurable evidence subject to specific principles of reasoning. Okay, so um, if a fingerprint is analyzed, there is a method of inquiry of how was that fingerprint um, evaluated? How was it removed from the crime scene? Um, um, how did the analysis, or the what was the procedure involved in developing the fingerprint? Okay, um, how um, was the fingerprint analyzed, and how was it compared to standard reference samples? How many subject was it compared to? So there has to be some specific principles of reasoning um, enforced. Okay. When we speak of empirical, all right, um, Empirical is referring to presenting certain data in front of um, um, a panel of scientists, or judges, that it can evaluate the procedures involved in collecting that evidence. Okay, make sure that it is properly analyzed statistically. Okay, does it um, does the analysis of the data um, collaborate with the intent um, of the investigator? Okay, and we'll get into this much more in a lot of cases as well, in which we'll be discussing, how the scientific method of certain types of laboratory techniques, just kind of like developing fingerprints. How do they do that? Okay, and how is it done scientifically? All right. In a textbook definition, forensic science is the application of science to those criminal and civil laws that are enforced by police agencies um, in a criminal justice system. So there are some enduring understandings. These are, like prime directives. Um, and the first is the textbook definition, again, of what forensic science is. All right. The second, it's evaluated using controlled scientific techniques. Okay, so um, a discussion in controlled scientific techniques. What do we mean by that? Okay, we're going to have to dive into that a lot more, because first of all, we have to address the fact that there's a difference between a controlled experiment and control groups within the experiment. So we have to have an understanding of that. Um, so if we are to dust for fingerprints on the surface of a car, all right, um, there has to be some knowledge about the process of actually dusting for fingerprints, what type of brush is utilized, what type of fingerprint powder is utilized, and how is that fingerprint from the crime scene uh, lifted and then analyzed in a laboratory. Okay, so it's a controlled scientific investigation, meaning the whole process of collecting the evidence, processing the evidence, is administered by using scientific techniques. Okay, that um, no other possible variables exist. Okay, uh, we want, you know, if it's we're talking about a car, that car should be impounded, so no one has access to it. In terms of, you know, um, 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 uh, covering up the print or smudging it, whatever, or adding to the print whatsoever. Okay, so everything has to be controlled. So there has to be a process of, okay, what is the best way? All right, uh, to minimize any other possible variable that could come into play. How are we going to preserve and protect this evidence? Okay. The third understanding is that forensic scientists come from many different fields of specialization. And that's something in chapter one, you got a good introduction to. For instance, their specializations relative to human teeth. That's called odontology, in which they examine bite mark analysis as well, forensic anthropology, the study of the identification of human bones to learn how um, how an individual may have died at the scene. How is that whole process done? And then finally, forensic science begins at the crime scene. Okay. When discussing the history of forensic science, one thing that I didn't put on here were dates involved. Okay, so as we did um, early on, um, well, let me just say, in this slide presentation, these are chronologically placed in order. Okay, so Archimedes used his principle of buoyant force to determine that King's Hero's crown was not made of entirely gold, and um, a lot of people recall this by seeing a picture of Archimedes. He actually got the idea is when he stepped into a bathtub and he noticed that the water overflowed, and which was the discovery of density. Okay, in which the volume of water that was displaced can determine um, wh- um, uh, not the mass or and the identity of a substance. And sure enough, the crown was not made of entire uh, of gold. Edmund Lockhart formulated his evidence cross transfer principle when two objects or a persons come in contact with one another, there is an exchange of debris. Okay, so think about putting your hands into a bag of Cheetos. Okay, um, there's a transfer of what is on your fingers in the first place, maybe some oils, some amino acids, is when you touch the inside of the bag. Some of those oils and amino acids come off, as well as in touching the Cheetos, some of the uh, sprayed on material that we know is like powdered cheese comes off and sticks to the fingers. Okay. The first system of personal identification was developed by Alphonse Bertillon, known as anthropometry. And when we get into fingerprinting, we'll actually um, model some of the anthropometric measurements of Bertillon's system, also known as Bertillonage. Okay. These are um, um, a vast number of measurements of the human body to identify a person. This was kind of developed in the early 19th century, and to actually um, um, identify prisoners who have been released or who have escaped from prison and committed crimes again. And so, like, for example, um, the measured length of your index finger. What is your hat size? And that could be measured by the circumference of your head. Okay. Um, what is your standing height versus what is your sitting height? So we're talking about all types of measurements like that. Matthew or Ophelia developed tests to detect poisons and their effects on uh, the human body systems. This was, Orphelia was kind of like the father of like forensic toxicology. Okay. And there's a good book about him. Um, I can't remember the name. I have it somewhere here at home. Colonel Calvin Goddard became an expert in firearms identification. um, Walter McCrone. Um, actually, let me go back uh, to Calvin Goddard. That picture there was Goddard is on the right wearing glasses. This is inside of the courtroom and handling of, of a firearm, a machine gun, if you will, that was used in the Boston Massacre. Walter McCrone made advancements in techniques associated with microscopic analysis of forensic science. As the picture depicts, this is a picture from like the 1960s. Francis Galton was the first to research anatomy of fingerprints and classifies them into loops, whorls, and arches. Juan Vucetich developed the first fingerprinting filing system based upon Galton's work. Here's an excellent example of how the science progresses based upon early investigations by prior forensic scientists. Ones like Vudovic would come along and enhance a particular field of forensic science, or just, excuse me, science based upon the reading of experiments of prior scientists. In 1897, Sir Edward Henry developed a classification for fingerprints that would be adopted by Scotland Yard and agencies around the U.S., like um, the Bureau of Identification in the United States, that actually had its start at um, Leavenworth Prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. And Herbert Hoover uh, uh, was assigned the duties to take over that, and ultimately it led into the formation of the FBI. Hans Gross published the first treatise on the application of science discipline to actual criminal investigations. In the early 1900s, Carl Landsteiner discovered the four main blood groups in humans. And one that I think, was ahead of his time was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He had a tremendous influence on forensics through his stories of Sherlock Holmes that we'll definitely revisit, particularly in our serology unit. And then, what's not mentioned in the text is Sir Alex Jeffreys and his invention of the process known as DNA fingerprinting. Some noteworthy news: Lockhart developed the first functional crime lab in Lyon, France. The first forensic uh, lab in the U.S. Was developed by August Vollmer in 1923, and this was within the Los Angeles Police Department. The FBI maintains the world's largest crime lab on the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. And there you see the four federal agencies that offer forensic services. A forensic scientist is skilled in scientific techniques, um, I'm sorry, scientific principles and techniques. Forensic scientists must follow strict guidelines at the crime scene, for which includes the collection of forensic evidence. And forensic scientists must follow strict guidelines in the lab in analyzing evidence. And there's just basically one reason why forensic science is held to some very high standards. It's because it needs to be admissible in a court of law. And that's where the whole discussion um, comes to. This last slide gives the answer keys to questions 1 through 15 that are in the Cornell notes, so you definitely want to check your responses. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us here at Wooten Forensic Science, and we'll see you next time.